Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Better Story podcast series that we are doing as New Community Church, as a church family. And as we go through the topics of the better story of things like sex and gender and relationships and identity and meaning and purpose, as we do all these things, we are going to have this accompanying podcast where we explore some of those topics in more depth than we're able to do on a Sunday, as well as getting some special guests who are specialists in their field and help us explore these things in fresh ways, giving new perspectives. And this episode is a little bit different. It's kind of our introductory episode where we kind of kick things off. And I have to say, we have a very, very special guest with us today, the one, the only, Katherine Brown. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you. Hello, John Brown. It's nice to meet you. Thanks for having me on this podcast.
I've heard a lot about you. It's it's great. It's great to finally see you in person. I'm glad that it's been possible.
I just wanted to say I'm a massive fan of your book. I know that you're an author, and I'm just a massive fan. So it's a privilege to be invited to speak to you today.
It is your privilege. You're right. I know. Yeah, more real available at all good bookshops.
I was wondering if I could get a signed copy.
Maybe. For those who are unaware, which I assume most people in the church won't be, but for those maybe listening, Katherine and I are actually married, but currently in different locations. There's not been a marital rift that has led to this. It is so that we can kind of test run this new podcast. And I guess the guests I'll be interviewing won't be married to me and in the same house.
Thank you, Lord, for monogamy.
That would be controversial.
Thank you, Lord, for technology. All of the ologies.
There we go. All the ologies. So, Katherine, as we're 3 weeks into our Better Story series, and I think one of the things that's really stood out to me is how many people have said to me that they've grown up in church, been in churches, in different places over many years, and yet have never heard these topics that we're exploring talked about. And I don't know if you've heard that too, but if you have, why do you think it is that so few churches address these topics?
Well, I didn't grow up in church, so yes, I have never heard church talk about these topics because I didn't grow up in church, and so I was never in rooms where that would have been a thing, which is quite interesting because growing up, even though I grew up in a non-Christian household, I sort of had an idea of what Christians thought about stuff like sex, gender, relationships, and had quite a black and white, like, basically Christians hate all those things and think all of it's awful and all of that. So I sort of absorbed that from pop culture. And I wonder whether churches now don't talk about this stuff because they are aware that is what culture thinks about church, and they don't want to feed into it. So they don't want to feed into the, like, we are against loads of things and we're all about saying, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. But I think the fear of not wanting to do that means that actually we've really robbed the church and robbed people from deep discipleship and from understanding the full gospel, because we haven't, in not talking about these topics, we haven't given people the full picture of what God actually says yes to and the adventure that God invites people into in sexuality and all of that. And it becomes a little bit of a, like, this is something we have to whisper about, or something that's a really awkward conversation in marriage prep or whatever. So I wonder whether it's that. I don't know whether you have any other thoughts on that. Obviously, you grew up in the church.
I 100% agree. Yeah, I grew up in church, and my parents actually moved around different denominations in churches. I mean, as a kid, we were in a Presbyterian church in America, first years of my life in America at that church. And then we moved back to the UK. We were in an Anglican church. And then my parents went to an ex-brethren non-denominational church. They then went to a Pentecostal church. Yeah, they definitely did the rounds. That my dad then tried to start a church that lasted like a couple months. And then
I would have joined your dad's church.
It was in a scout hut. There's about 5 of us, 4 of whom were my family. And
Who
yeah,
was
that was
the
a
other
memory.
person?
I think it was someone who I'd gone to like Sunday school in another church with, and her mum or something. I can't
All
remember. It
right. Oh,
was,
well done, David and Janet.
yeah, fair play to them. They went for it in the scout hut, but yeah, it only lasted a couple months. And then after that, I went to a youth group at a Baptist church, and then an evening service at an Elim Pentecostal church, and yeah, all sorts. And then I spent time in other circles too. But the thing that was consistent is that I just remember, whether it was in youth group or on Sundays, things like sex and relationships just weren't really addressed. And thankfully, I had parents who did talk about them. There's certain topics I wish my parents had talked to me more about, like porn, for example. That wasn't really discussed. And all I knew is that the worst thing you could ever do is have sex before marriage. But then in marriage, sex was amazing, but it was kind of a dirty thing it just sort of confused me. And yeah, they didn't fully avoid it, but equally there could have been a lot better teaching. And so that's what I'm grateful. We're in a church where we're able to talk about these things, and our youth are doing that at the moment. I don't know if people are aware, but the youth are going through these sorts of topics too. So I'm just grateful that they can have, yeah, what I wasn't able to have. So
It's
yeah,
great.
I'm thankful to have that. I think another thing, I don't know what your thoughts on this are, but I know I've heard some people say, well, these things should be talked about more in one-to-one settings than on the stage, because on the stage, you can't really be as pastoral and sensitive than you can in a one-to-one. What would you say to that?
I mean, in one way, yes, agreed. I think the one-to-one space, we definitely need to be having these conversations. And if the way we were doing our Sundays was, right now, everyone put your hand up if you're currently doing this sin,
Yeah, you can imagine
and
that'd
then
be great. Yeah.
everyone look around and
Yeah,
look
yeah.
at them.
Come to the front if you've looked at porn in the last month, and we'll
Yeah,
yeah.
that would be a
With
little bit
well, we do the
odd.
classic with every eye closed. Put up your hand. I
Yeah.
can imagine there would be a lot of eyes that weren't closed.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of little squinty open eyes if that was to happen. So
Classic.
we're not doing that. We're not looking to expose people. We're not looking to make people feel comfortable. But we really do believe that this stuff isn't our dirty little secret. It's not
Mm,
something that needs to be hidden. Actually, the
yeah.
way that we've approached topics like sex before is that we've gone hush, hush, hush. And that can it can just make people feel a lot of shame. I think
Hmm.
when you hear stories from the front, when you hear people's real life experience from the front, from the stage, there is a huge, I don't know, it brings a lot of freedom in the room because people
Yeah.
go, oh, I've never heard anyone say that.
Yeah.
And I think our prayer, well, not wanting to speak on your behalf, John, but I think our prayer would be that we'd want this stage stuff to spark really good one-to-one conversations
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
discipleship moments. We're hoping that actually this is a springboard to freedom in people's lives and
Mm,
adventure and knowing more about God. And yeah, that will happen in the small group. That will happen in the one-to-one settings. Like, you're going to want to confess stuff to one person or to two close friends or to someone who's mentoring you or whatever. You're not going to want to do that on a Sunday and stand up in front of everyone and say, this is what I'm doing or whatever. But the Sunday is a beautiful place to, to have that conversation started and to say, actually, as a church, we're not afraid of these things, and we want these things to be a conversation that everyone's having and that we're having together as a community. I just think it's very healthy and important. So yes, stage is
definitely.
great, but also we do need the one-to-one and we do need the small group as well.
That's it. And I think you put your finger on there. It's having both, because, when I've had this discussion and debate with other church leaders, they say, our hope is that it will come up in the one-to-one setting. And I'm like, one, from my experience, it's not the kind of thing that necessarily just naturally, comes up in conversation. Like, you're chilling at Costa having your coffee, and then, you've been chatting about the weather, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, so, yeah, like, what's your identity based in? Like, it doesn't necessarily happen. I mean, maybe for some people, I'm a pretty deep person, but even for myself, like, those things aren't kind of every day. And I think there's something that's great about talking about it from a stage that then allows those conversations to more naturally happen. So even just like yesterday, so we're recording this on a Monday. Yesterday we had a talk all about singleness, and then it was awesome going to the pub after, and Catherine, you and I were there with about, I don't know, 8 or 9 other people, and just naturally the conversation was talking about topics of singleness and serving God and being content, and just how different the Christian view of singleness is, and all those things. And I'm like,
Yeah.
this probably wouldn't have just naturally happened. And I know those kind
Yeah.
of conversations are happening in friendship groups and across community gatherings, and that's why I think it's so helpful having the Sunday talks too, because on the Sunday as well, obviously
Definitely.
you can have someone unpack the theology, the scriptural basis for things, and so it's not just kind of a couple mates in the pub talking about their feelings about a topic. It's like, well, we've heard the Bible read, the Bible unpacked, we've heard cultural stories, cultural examples, and now we've got food for thought to go away and base our conversations on. And I think that's why, yeah, it's so good as a church that we have this approach of Sundays, yes, but communities and friendships too.
Yeah.
And I think that makes such a big difference.
Yeah, and it helps it not be such a crunching gear change in conversations. So I think it will really serve our leaders in the church when they're meeting up with people. They can very naturally ask these questions now, because they'll go, what do you think about the sermon series? What did you think about
Yeah.
this topic? And I know for me, thinking back on when I was a student and when I was processing, wanting to tell my story with people and wanting to share like sin in my life and share where I'd got it wrong before being a Christian. And I was struggling with real shame around that. And I would go into coffees with people thinking, I want to tell them, I want to tell them, I want to tell them. But then it's all on you as like a 19-year-old to bring that crunching gear change of like, let me
Yeah.
tell you this big secret and thing in my life, which is so hard. And the person
Yeah.
isn't, if they don't know you that well, they're not going to naturally want to bring that up. So you kind of, you have to be the one to do it. But when there's shame there, shame silences you. And to get through that, it's a huge step. But actually, if you're going through a series, it would be very natural if I had sat down with someone for them to go, what do you think about this? And me to go, well, actually, yeah, this is really relevant to my life, or this is really relevant to what I'm processing from my past. So, yeah, I'm really hoping that this series brings freedom in people's lives.
Definitely. And you know, even just in recent days, I've seen that the power of all these things we're talking about, where someone had listened to Tim and Amy's sermon on sex in Eltham, and so that sounds weird. Sex in Eltham. There's a lot of these conversations. Like I have to say at the moment, my search history, researching for this stuff, my Google search history is a nightmare. But anyway, that's a side note. But yeah, listening to the sermon that Tim and Amy did about sex. That they preached in Eltham. So I listened to it. And let me just say, if you haven't already listened to it, I'd encourage you to go onto SoundCloud and check it out. Of course, the nature of being a multi-site, kind of multiple places church is that different people are preaching on different things in different places, and all will bring a different kind of perspective with the same gospel truth, with the same biblical basis, but obviously with different experiences. And one of the great things that Tim actually brought out in that sermon was some of his own personal testimony, and sharing very powerfully and very honestly about lust and porn, and just really great. If you haven't listened, please do. But just chatting to someone who said, look, I listened to that sermon and what Tim shared, and you know what, that made me think, I think I need to do a bit of business with God, and can you pray for me? And I just thought that was awesome, how something that happened on the Sunday then spilled out into a completely kind of non-church, as it were, environment. I mean, obviously, everywhere is sacred. It's not that only repentance and prayer happens in church. Amen. But yeah, it was great that, this Sunday experience had led to a kind of a conviction moment that led to just a conversation, and everything you just said about it wasn't this crunching gear change when they brought it up, because it's like, yeah, we're going through this stuff as a church. So it makes sense that these things will happen. So I've loved that, and I'm really believing this series is going to have a huge impact in many lives.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
So,
great.
so just kind of, no, just a kind of question for you linked into that is, what have been some of your favorite things a few weeks in this series? What have been some of your favorite, apart from obviously hearing me preach, which I know you would say, you know, my number one fan, and no, but
Just
what have been,
hearing Jon preach about sex,
yeah,
that was not uncomfortable at all for me.
yeah, no, not at all. But yeah, no, what have been some of your highlights?
I think my main highlight really has been that we have had, I'm sure across all of our services, but particularly at 3:30, we've had quite a few people that wouldn't call themselves Christians just wander in. And if I'm honest, when that first started happening at the beginning of this series, I was like, oh no, why are you coming to church now? Like in this
Yeah.
series, this is like the worst time.
Do I sort
Like,
of compare that to is it's almost like, I mean, I don't know if this was the same in your home growing up, but I remember like as a teenager, like you'd be watching a film, like me and my brother watching a film, just going for like an hour and a half, and then at the exact moment that the sort of like romantic scene, shall we say, starts, the door opening, like your mum walks in and you're like, no, like, why did you come in this exact moment? Like, how it's almost like there's this sixth sense and it's like the most embarrassing thing. And you're like, well, no, it's not. It's nowhere. And it's like, you know what I mean? It's almost like that with church. It's like, why did you pick this Sunday to come? Like, you came in at the like awkward moment. Like, you should have
yeah.
come when we spoke about God's love or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And a few of them, like when I was chatting to them about why they came to church or whatever, like who invited you or whatever, nobody invited them. They just
Mm.
rocked up. So I'm like, oh
Mm.
gosh, the Lord has brought you here for such a time as this.
Mm.
Which again raised my faith for actually, maybe God will use this to save people. And I
Mm.
think my highlight has been then speaking to those people after the service and hearing their reflections. And now, of course, like they're polite and British. So who knows what their behind the scenes conversations are and whether they were actually very offended. But I think the fact that they stuck around and had a tea or a coffee with us afterwards shows
Mm.
me that they weren't. And actually, there was something intriguing about what they heard. And
Mm.
I think just hearing some of their reflections around, they can see what's happening in culture, they see the world around them, and it's just interesting to hear a different perspective.
Yeah.
And I think, you know what, bring it on, Lord. Let's see more people that don't know Jesus rock up throughout this series and let them hear the beauty of the better story, because we really do believe it is a better story. You know, we
Mm-hmm.
can we can think, oh no, I don't know, we need to wait to tell people about this, like they have to be further down the line, we have to really look after how we package it and whatever. And there's truth in that. We want to be aware with all of these sermons that there are non-Christians in the room, and we want to be wise and we want to be kind in everything that we say. It's truth in love. That's been our whole thing throughout this
Mm-hmm.
series. But also, let's not be ashamed of the gospel, the
Yeah.
fullness
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
it, and
Mm-hmm.
let's trust God and invite people in. So that's been my highlight, just seeing people that don't know Jesus wander in and respond well, and maybe even take a little step towards Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm the same. Also, just one aside is one of the reasons we're recording this is we're testing out some new software for our podcast, which we've never used before.
Is my
So
hair in
we
the
don't
way?
even know. Catherine already knows her hair is rubbing against the microphone. So
John
I don't
said
know
I'm
if that
too
came.
expressive.
Anyone who's seen Catherine speak will know that she is a very expressive and passionate person, which is good. It's very good. It's very good. But when
But
you're when you've got
not for a podcast.
when you've got a mic dangling next to your lovely brown long hair, it can rub against the mic. So these are the kind of things that we're
Pray for me, people.
learning as we go. Pray, hashtag pray for Catherine. But anyway, it's all good. We're trying to keep this as raw and unedited as possible, and keep all the messy bits in, because that is what life is like. But yeah, I think for me, what's been great is, you know, again, going back to the question, why don't people talk about this, you know, on Sundays at some churches? I think there is just an element, not that maybe they'd honestly admit this, but it can kind of just feel like this is our dirty little secret. Like, we know we're meant to believe this, but is it really good news? And I think we have this conviction that the gospel is good news for every area of life, not just for salvation, but for our bodies and our identities and
Yeah.
our relationships. And this
Yeah.
isn't something to be ashamed of. And I've loved, you know, going up to people who are new to faith, new to church, maybe first time in church. And yeah, you think, oh man, was this a good week to come for your first time to church? And you say to me, you know, how you find it? Like chatting to someone yesterday, how have you found it so far? And people saying, I'm absolutely loving it. Like, it's so helpful. It's been so useful hearing about these things and thinking about these things. And
Yeah,
I've not been surprised by that, but I have been encouraged by that. And
yeah,
yeah, I think I'm just grateful that, yeah, the good news is good news. And I just encourage people that we don't need to be ashamed of this. We don't
you
need
know,
to keep this sort of hid. It's not like the skeleton in our closet we have to keep hidden, but this is good news. And we have a hurting world, a broken world. It's
mm,
not kind of like the stories people are living in are making them kind
yeah,
of satisfied and content. Like, there's so much anxiety and pain and hurt out there, and we have a better story to share. So I think
yeah.
that's what I've been so encouraged by.
I think that's why it's so funny when we as Christians can feel like a bit weird about what we believe on this stuff. And it makes
Mm,
sense because it's super countercultural, and we know that we won't be popular and that there'll be pushback and that people will disagree with us, and we don't like to stand out, we like to fit in, all of that. We're very British, we like to be polite, we don't like to rock the boat. So I understand all of that, and I have those I would say, sinful tendencies in my heart as well to feel ashamed of certain things.
hmm
But then you look at the world around and you think the way that people are living and the stories that they're telling themselves and that are shaping their behaviors, it's not leading to human flourishing. Like when you look at any stats on basically anything, whether it's mental health, whether it's relationship breakdown, whether it's kids and anxiety, or whatever it is, the stats are like not great. The stories that the world are telling, it doesn't lead to flourishing. And yet, God gives us a clear blueprint and rubric and plan for how to live in a way that leads to life and life in all of its fullness, to flourish and to thrive in the world. And so I think actually we're speaking into a culture where people, they might have very strong views, and what we might hear online are these people that are like, I believe this and I'm angry about this and whatever. But actually, when you meet people one to one, they are hurting, like you said, John. They are lonely, they are broken, they're struggling. And even if they might have very strong views on certain things, I mean, I would have before as a Christian, they will definitely agree with you that there are problems in the world and that the solutions that they found are not helping or working. So I think most people do have open ears to hear if people do have a solution to something else, which is why I think people are so interested in spiritual things. Whether they're turning to Christianity or not, that's another story. But they're looking for something more. They just want something that will fill this void, fill this gap, and try and make sense of the world around them.
Definitely. And I'd like to say a bit more into that. This past weekend, you were speaking, as well as Hannah Silly, at the New Ground Leadership Conference. Both did a great job. And whenever those talks become available, I'd recommend anyone who wasn't there do listen to those talks, all about handing over to the next generation and raising the next generation in the better story ultimately. And you in your talk, you've referenced it just briefly in what you just said before, but about the next generation, the openness to spirituality, and could you just share a bit more about that, about the signs you mentioned about a lot of the depressing statistics that we see, and a lot of things that point to things that worry us, concern us, sadden us. But there was something in a Tinder survey which I found very interesting, that kind of intrigued you and made you think about the opportunities we have as Christians. Say a bit more about that.
Yeah, so Tinder do this sort of dating survey research thing every year, and they look at dating trends. They're looking at all sorts of things. Are people still dating? Are people still doing whatever? I don't know. They look at lots of different things. I'm not going to go into what Tinder is. I'm not going to go into what it's used for or some of the things they survey.
I like how
Anyway,
you're trying to keep it really sort of like tame and PG. Like, we haven't just already in this podcast talked about sex and porn and lust. But anyway, it's good. It's good that you're trying to, protect people. That's good, Catherine. It's good. I like that.
sorry.
You're like the
Right.
protective parent who's like, I don't want my kid to know about this, and then all the time the kid's at school and knows way more than you probably even know about some of these things. Anyway, but keep going, keep going.
Oh, that sounds like baggage, John.
Maybe. Thankfully, I didn't grow up in the era of smartphones. Praise God. Oh man, I do feel for our kids these days. But anyway, that's a podcast for another day, which I'm sure we'll do on the fun and games of parenting in 2023 and all the craziness that comes with it. But anyway, back to Tinder.
Let's get rid of all technology.
Yeah, become Amish. That's the solution.
Yeah, so anyway, in this survey that Tinder do, Tinder's a dating app if you don't know, and they surveyed loads of people and they found out that basically in lots of people's bios on Tinder, they include spiritual things. So whether that is zodiac signs, all of that stuff. But a lot of people are actually including their manifestation goals. And now some of you at home are going to be thinking, what is manifestation? The only time I've heard of manifestation is either people manifesting demons or the presence of God being manifest. I can assure you, well, it might be about manifesting demons, but I can assure you it's not about manifesting the presence of God, unfortunately. Manifesting is basically this idea that quite a lot of young people and older than young people have clung onto, and it's become pretty mainstream. Like, if you're on the Instagram sort of space, online space, you will see this everywhere if you follow anyone in their 20s that doesn't know Jesus.
I remember
Where
actually when a girl who won Strictly, I think it was a couple of years ago, it was on the BBC homepage and her reflecting on winning. And she said, I've been manifesting this moment since I was a young girl.
Yeah. And so manifesting is basically like the idea that you are in control of your destiny, of your reality, of your future. And the way that you make things happen or not happen is by manifesting it. And that means writing things down over and over again or thinking things over and over again. So you have to be totally in control of your thoughts and over what you're putting into the universe. So as a Christian looking into this, I'm thinking this is the original sin. It is. People are thinking, I can be God. I can create my own future. I can create my own destiny. That is it. It's the original sin. It's the original temptation of man. You can know everything. You can be God. But what we've spoken about in this series as well is philosophy and the idea of expressive individualism, that you can create who you are, that the search for identity is an inward search, that you have to look inside to find out who you are and then, go and live in line with that. And it makes sense that the spirituality that this generation and that people are experimenting with is manifesting because it's so in line with the philosophy that they're immersed in. So of course, they're going to look for some sort of spirituality that affirms the idea that they're in control and that the inward search is the way to salvation, to freedom. And so that's why they are falling into things like manifesting, which is very sad. But we also can't blame them because they've never heard another way. Manifesting is so popular in pop culture, in songs, in online, and I just think, are we getting the gospel out there in equal measure? Do people have the opportunity to hear the good news that actually, it's a great thing that we're not in control and that we can't make our destiny a reality, and that actually God has a plan for our lives, and actually we can know salvation not by what we do and not by our works, but just through faith in Jesus? Like, are we telling people that? I'm not sure. Are we equipping our young people and actually speaking into things like manifesting and saying, all of your friends are doing this? It is really, really dark. Don't get involved with that. Like, that is going to completely rob you of goodness and of joy and of peace. And actually, it's quite demonic. It is demonic.
Yeah, and I suppose like with all these things, there's the sort of the spectrum of there's the the things like the tarot cards where it very much is that I'm trying to tap into a sort of a very clearly spiritual thing, and then there's the sort of the positive affirmations, and with all of it, well, especially the kind of more positive affirmations, you can see, we talk about it, finding freedom stuff, don't we, about the the value of speaking positive words over you. But I think, as you pointed out, so much of all of this is like we keep saying throughout this series, it's all about you being the center of the universe, and it's you who defines truth, and it's you who defines your identity, and it's you who's in control. And whereas prayer is a position of submission to God and his will, saying, your kingdom come, your will be done. Manifesting is a position of, I am God and I will manifest my destiny and my truth into existence. And so it's almost like kind of, the devil likes to, it's often that he doesn't come as like this clear, evil, terrible thing. It's kind of like good things warped, like almost, like you mentioned the garden, like he comes to Adam and Eve, and comes to Eve and says, God, he comes as this one who wants to help her, and sort of twists the words of God and manipulates the words of God, and convinces her that this is for your good. Of course, God wants your good. So, but I think the thing that encourages me with this whole thing of manifesting in spirituality is that there can be this idea that young people are completely opposed to any sort of spirituality. And the generation I grew up in, it was very much like, well, atheism is now king, and anyone thinks it's ridiculous to believe there's a spiritual realm. Like, we're science, spirituality is dumb. Like, and so when I went to uni, for example, the conversations they would have in like they would do these evangelistic events where they'd run like is Christianity anti-science? Whereas now I think we've seen a real shift where faith in science alone is diminishing, and a lot of the kind of old school atheism that was very like hardened, the Richard Dawkins-esque kind of atheism, really is not the norm anymore. It's seen as closed-minded. It's seen as a kind of not fulfilling what people are really searching for, and that excites me. And I have to be honest, I don't think it's meant there's tons of people are like, give me Jesus, but I do. I mean,
it reminds me of when we did Alpha together, John, when I was a student. This is years ago. We've run a few different Alphas at, the church and at home since then, whatever. But I remember this one because it was the first time I think you'd done Alpha with students here in Sidcup. And it was a load of my friends.
The students from drama and dance colleges, whereas I went to Nottingham Uni, where it's like academic, sort of traditionally in terms of like people doing politics and that sort of stuff.
And also, John, you are old, so
I am old. Wow.
Just the times have changed. The culture, the philosophy that people are living in, it is changed. So yeah,
I'm taking that bit out. That's getting edited.
No edits, raw.
Raw.
Anyway, so I remember when you sat down with my friends and you asked them whether they could believe that there was a supernatural realm, because that was a question you would ask people at Nottingham and they'd go, no, that's ridiculous. And then you'd have to spend the rest of the time trying to convince them of the supernatural. Whereas all my friends were like, yeah, believe there's a supernatural realm. And then you'd say, oh, do you believe that there could be a God? They're like, yeah, for sure. Oh, do you believe that could be Jesus? They're like, yeah, why not? And you're like, oh, wow, that they've become a Christian. This is so amazing. And then it unravels. Well, it could be Jesus, and it could also be this God, and it could be that. So I think the biggest challenge evangelistically in our time is actually pluralism. So the idea that actually there are multiple gods, multiple ways to heaven, multiple ways to salvation. And we are preaching an offensive gospel that says, no, Jesus is the only way. And so that is what we're trying to communicate to people. And I think that is one of the things that we need to learn how to do with our young people, and we need to equip them to do, because they will, all of their friends at school, at uni, whatever, will probably believe there's something more, will probably believe that there's some sort of universe, that there are lots of options for God, and they will probably be pluralists. So we need to learn how to speak into that. And I think that's what, we need to do.
Definitely. And that's what I have enjoyed so much about this Better Story series, is a lot of it is about learning to read the stories of our culture. And just like Paul does when he goes to Athens and he sees, wait, that's a statue to an unknown god. And then he meets with the Athenians and he talks about this statue to begin with. And then he quotes some of their prophets and poets to them. And the philosophers and poets to them. And he shows that he cares enough, first of all, to take their culture and their history and their beliefs seriously. But then he's able to see the sort of the deeper questions, the deeper longings that they have, and how they're not being fulfilled. Because if you're having a statue to an unknown god, it's kind of like we we want to know this God, but this God is unknowable. And he's like, no, you can know God, and actually God has a name. His name is Jesus. And I think and that's how I kind of feel in this openness to spirituality. Like there's a searching for something, but again, is it fulfilling? And whatever is the question underneath manifesting, for example, the desire underneath manifesting, it's like, okay, well, we see that story, and how do we start to tell the better story to those people? And just like in Athens, there'll be some who'll be like, nah, sorry, like I'm not interested. But just like in Athens, there'll be some who say, I'd like to hear more about this. And I think that's what we have to do. Is we have the hard thing, isn't it? Like it's so hard. The stories are constantly changing. Like it's mad to think, like you say, I am old. Fair enough. I am old, but I'm not that old. Like
No,
I
you're not.
graduated from university, like, I don't know, 14 years ago, which is kind of a long time. I can't believe it's been that long. But genuinely, there's things that my non-Christian friends would have believed and publicly said back then, that now, if I was to say them, they would say I was bigoted and hateful, and they would say those beliefs are terrible and judge anyone who held the beliefs that they held like 2 minutes ago, which is a sign of how quickly our culture is moving, and it can feel a bit exhausting. And I think the temptation as a Christian can be like, you know what? I'm just going to tap out of this. Like, I'm going to bunker down. I'm going to get in my holy huddle. I'm just going to hang out with Christians, and I'm all good. Like these weird and wacky and mental things going on in culture, like they are, it can burn, but I'm getting out of this. But we're not called to be
No.
outside. We're called to be in the world, not of the world, but still in the world, and
Yeah.
teaching and preaching that better story and living it
And
out.
and if we have that response that you just said around, you know what, I'm just gonna stay out of that.
Peace out.
Peace out, guys. We are totally misunderstanding the heart of God and the passion that he has for this next generation and for lost people, and the part that we have to play in that. And we will lose a generation if we do not know God's heart for it, and our heart doesn't break. And when we look at these things, if our position is, that's crazy, that's wild, look at the world, that's a Pharisaical heart. Our hearts should be one like Christ, that breaks and weeps over the generation, that cries over it, and seeks to find any opportunity to invite this generation into right relationship with God. So at this leadership conference that we were at over the weekend, the New Ground Leadership Conference, there was a guy there called Lex. I don't actually know what his last name is. Do you know what his
I
last
can't
name is?
pronounce it. It begins with an L. Anyone who's old school New Frontiers will know it.
Mr.
Lex
Lex L.
Lucidius.
Sorry, Lex. And he's an evangelist, a pastor in South Africa. And I just thought he was great at this conference. But he did a seminar on evangelism. And he also spoke about Acts 17, Paul in Athens. And his whole point around it, I mean, he made the same points that you just made, John, but his other point around it was Christians have always initiated evangelism. They haven't waited for people to come into the church to then tell them about Jesus. They haven't waited for the opportunity to just arise. They have been the ones on the front foot looking to create evangelistic opportunities. Paul doesn't go and stand in Athens in the public space and just wait to be asked a question. He takes time to study and research, and then with that study and research, he is then like, and now I'm going to speak, and I'm going to say something, and I'm going to challenge. And I found that personally very challenging, because it made me think, how often is my position, I'm going to wait for opportunities, I'm going to wait till that person asks the right question or whatever. And it's amazing when that does happen. But actually, where in my life am I looking for evangelistic opportunities and actually initiating those, like going for it and creating it? So I found that very, very challenging. And I think that's what we need to reach this generation. They don't know the questions to ask. They're spiritually open, but they've got no biblical basis. They've got no worldview that would point them anywhere near Jesus. Like, they're not being taught about it in school necessarily. It's not what they're seeing online. How can we as Christians be on the front foot, understanding the culture, doing our research, understanding what's going on in pop culture, all the celebrities that they love, whatever, and then how can we create those evangelistic opportunities? So I don't have an answer to that, because it's something that I've literally just, I feel quite convicted and challenged on over the last weekend. So I will let you know in a few months' time if I've sorted that out, guys. But I'm sure you will know what that looks like in your world, listener. So yes.
Yeah, and in some ways it is something that takes a lot of work and a lot of time, and the Bible talks about being prepared, being ready to give an answer for the hope that we have within us. So there is an element of work involved in intentionality, but I also think there is just a natural listening ear. Like, I think ultimately, if you're someone who loves people, then just being around people and asking them questions about their life and showing care, they'll say things and open up, and then in that moment you'll start to, we've used a lot of big terms sometimes in this series, like expressive individualism and postmodernism, secularism, but those things aren't actually kind of out there abstract. They're real everyday things that come up in conversation, and it's just starting to, like, I've loved some people saying, like, when you said expressive individualism, that really confused me, but now I feel like I kind of understand it, because I'm seeing it in, like when you're watching a Netflix show and you see something like, oh yeah, that's what that is. And
Yeah.
and it's not that we all have to become PhD students in philosophy. It's just caring about people, and it's starting to know, how do I tell the gospel or share the gospel in a way in which will help this person to it, almost kind of speaking it in their language. And I don't think, like you say, we do have to care about this next generation. I think one of the best things James has taught into in recent months is with Hezekiah, where Hezekiah, things have gone pretty well for him, but then it emerges that the next generation is not looking good, and he basically is like, yeah, like, I'm happy because I'm all good, my generation's all good. And we just can't have that attitude. Like, the gospel needs to, it's like at the baton that has to be passed on. And it is hard to see where things are going, but what are we going to do? We're just going to sit back, complain, or sit back and moan, or sit back and criticize? Or are we going to give people an invitation to know the better story? And we have to believe that it's still good news in 2023. It's not just that, in years gone by, the gospel had power, or the gospel is good news. No, people still need the gospel, and it's still good news. It's still the better story in 2023.
And God is still in control. And I think sometimes when we talk about generation and culture, yes, there is darkness. I mean, when you look at the time when Jesus was alive, there was certainly darkness there too, and false beliefs and all sorts of weirdness and craziness. So we're not alone in this. It's not like the world is, totally degraded. It looks different to what it looked like when Jesus was around in some ways, but in lots of ways there are some similarities. And so I think we can't allow our hearts to get depressed, or allow our hearts to get to be like, oh, it's not worth it, it's impossible, whatever. God is powerful and is in control. And we've seen that even across the life of New Community. We've seen young people wander into church. They've never been invited. They've seen something on TikTok. They've seen something on Instagram that's made them go, you know what, maybe I should give Jesus a go. And then they've given their lives to Jesus, and we've baptized them in recent months. And so God is still on the move. We're still seeing incredible things happen, and God will continue to save people. That's what he does. He's going to be saving young people all over the place.
Amen.
And so we can have hope, and we can have joy, and we can see this as an adventure. And I just feel like God is taking us deeper as a church as we seek to understand culture. Actually, we will have more opportunities, and we'll see the opportunities and have more confidence and boldness to initiate those conversations about Jesus and the gospel, because we know what we're speaking into. Sometimes what stops people talking about Jesus is because they look at the lives of their friends and think, well, they're fine. No, when you understand culture and when you fully understand the gospel, you know that no one is fine without Jesus. No one is fine until they have responded to the gospel, until they are saved. And so I think this series is really helping with that. And just the formation of our people, it's just wanting people to grow into the likeness of Christ. And I've personally found it really helpful in my life and challenging. And I think this is a really hope-filled, joy-filled time as a church.
Amen. Amen. Now, a lot to be excited for. And we're not there. We haven't finished this series yet. 3 weeks in. We've got a few more weeks to go for part 1. And then in the new year, we will go into part 2. But yeah, looking forward to this Sunday and the next couple of weeks. And Katherine, you're this Sunday going to be preaching in Eltham. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm preaching in Eltham this week on sexuality and then doing the same sermon the week after at both of our SIG Cup meetings.
Great. I am so much looking forward to that. And then after that Sunday where you preach in Sid Cup morning and afternoon, we then have a Wednesday evening event on the 29th of November where we're going to be joined by Adam Curtis, who is not only a good friend of mine and Katherine's. You've got to know him. He was a curate at Christchurch Sid Cup, just around the corner from our Sid Cup building. And not only he's a great friend, he's also someone who has a lot to speak into the area of sexuality, and he's linked in with the organization Living Out. If you haven't heard of them, do check them out. And that's going to be a great night where we're going to hear a bit of Adam's testimony and his journey of faith and with sexuality, as well as a chance for people to ask their questions and submit questions in advance and talk about things on the night too. But I think that's going to be a great night to go into this topic, which is so at the forefront of cultural conversations, for us to be able to talk about this more, both on the Sunday, but also during the week. So you looking forward to that, Katherine?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I'm excited. I think it will be a wonderful moment for us as a church. And then I'm so glad that we've got that evening to sort of unpack things further. I'm really wanting our sermon on sexuality to be evangelistic, to be looking at the person who's not yet a Christian in the room, obviously wanting to equip and serve our people as well. But yeah, I also want to show that it's possible to share the gospel even with this controversial issue. So I'm hoping that will happen this Sunday. And then, just really looking forward to that event on the 29th as well, because it will give us some time to really get into the nitty gritty that you can't really get into when it's just a monologue from the front. So looking forward to everyone's questions. And Adam is just great. So we are so blessed to have him coming to SIG Cup to join us and share his story.
Adam is great, and as an aside, one of my favorite things about Adam is he is very tall. He is a very tall guy. Apparently, he is. I think he's told me this, that he is the same height as the standard UK door frame, which I think is 6'6". Is that right? Something like that.
He's the tallest curate in the Church of England, as in he's
that's
like
his
the
claim.
tallest.
I don't know
man.
if that's an official.
He's so tall. There's no one taller than Adam.
Tall. He is no one on the planet. But what's weird for me is I'm a 6 foot guy, but when I hug him, it's a weird feeling because I feel like a little kid. It's sort of like for a lot of people, it's probably a normal experience, but I'm not used to it. And it's
Jon, I can't believe you're going to end the podcast on this. This is the
deepest part of the podcast. This is what people need to take away. This is what will be in their heads as they finish listening to this podcast. Is an image of me hugging the 6'6".
Jon just feels weird because me and Adam used to go to the same gym when he worked here, and there would be times at the gym when Adam first started coming that the owner of the gym thought that Adam was Jon, because in one way they look similar, but then so it was like Adam's the tall one, Jon's the short one, and I don't think Jon had ever been called short in his life, so it was just a weird experience for Jon. So
it was humbling. There we go. We're kind of like a bit like, those Russian dolls where you have like the big one, the medium size, and they kind of fit inside each other.
Who's
like
the tiny one?
I don't know. Maybe we can on the 29th we'll try and find the sort of the mini one, and we get a picture next to each other.
Weird, Jon.
This has
got so weird.
As I said earlier in the podcast, this is the first one. We're learning about how the best way to do this. We've got a very special guest coming next, which I'm excited for. I might as well say now on Wednesday this week, in a couple of days, I'm going to be recording with Glyn Harrison, and Glyn wrote a book called A Better Story, which is what we have based the title of this series on. And it's a great book, and I'd encourage you to read it. It answers a lot of the questions we have been discussing in this, all about cultural narratives and how we can preach the better story. But I got in touch with Glyn, and he was delighted to come onto our podcast. So let's hope that he has a good experience, and some of the teething problems we've worked out in this one will not be the case when we record him in a couple of days. And I probably won't talk to him about being hugged by a taller man.
Jon, stop. Just stop.
All right, well, maybe we'll stop there. Well, I think that
we are so excited to have Glyn join us on this podcast. It's going to be great. I can't wait. We love you, church. Thank you if you've got this far through the podcast. We hope you had the most fantastic week, whatever you're doing. And we hope that you have many opportunities to talk about the better story that Jesus is inviting us all into.
Amen. God bless you, everyone, and have a great week.